she found a title folded in her grandfather's Bible. It led to 80 acres no one knew existed. What she discovered there wasn't just land. It was a choice that would redefine her entire life. If you've ever felt like you were starting from nothing, I think this story will mean something to you. Take a second to subscribe because we talk about real second chances here. The day I turned 18 was the day I ceased to exist, at least on paper. For the state, I was no longer a ward, no longer a case file, no longer a problem to be managed. I was just done. The transition from being a line item in a budget to being a person with no safety net happened in the time it took for the social worker, a tired woman named Carol with perpetually sad eyes, to sign a form and hand me a manila envelope. Inside was my birth certificate, my social security card, and a check for $217. My severance package from the system. Happy birthday. The group home, a tired-looking Victorian that had long since given up its charm, was already a memory before the front door clicked shut behind me. The sound was so final, a period at the end of a long, miserable sentence. I stood on the cracked sidewalk with a single duffel bag at my feet, the cool October air feeling thin and sharp in my lungs. Freedom, I'd been told, was what I was supposed to want. But it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like falling. Carol had one more thing for me. She came back out, her coat pulled tight against the wind, and handed me a cardboard box sealed with yellowing tape. It was heavy, and the corners were soft from years of storage. "This was your grandfather's," she said, her voice flat with professional detachment. "It's been in the county storage locker since he passed. They release it to next of kin on their 18th birthday. You're it." I hadn't thought about my grandfather, Abe, in years. Not really. He was a ghost, a half-remembered scent of sawdust and Old Spice, a gruff voice humming off-key. He'd been my whole world until I was 6, and then he was just gone. A heart attack, they told me. Quick. One day he was there, lifting me onto his shoulders so I could see over the crowds at the town fair, and the next, I was being interviewed by strangers in a sterile office. The box felt like an anchor, another weight pulling me down when I was already struggling to tread water. I thanked Carol, though the word felt hollow. She just nodded and retreated back into the house, back to the other kids who were still on the clock, still someone's responsibility. I was on my own. I took the box to the bus station, the only place I could think to go. It was a place for people in transit, and that's what I was. I didn't have a destination. I bought a coffee I couldn't afford and sat on a hard plastic bench, the box on my lap. For an hour, I just stared at it. It was a time capsule from a life I barely remembered, a life before the system had scrubbed all the color out of my world. Finally, my fingers, numb from cold and nerves, fumbled with the tape. It peeled away with a dry, ripping sound. The smell that rose from the box was the first thing that hit me. It was him. It was the faint, dusty smell of his workshop, of old paper and pipe tobacco. My throat tightened. Inside there wasn't much. A tarnished silver watch that didn't run. A handful of faded photographs of a woman with my eyes, my grandmother, I assumed, who had died before I was born. A worn flannel shirt, still holding the ghost of his shape in its shoulders. And at the very bottom, a heavy, leather-bound Bible, its cover worn smooth at the edges. I ran my thumb over the gold leaf letters, mostly flaked away. It felt like an artifact from another civilization. Abe wasn't a religious man, not in any way I could remember. He'd always said his church was the forest, and his prayers were the sound of a saw cutting through pine. I didn't know why he'd even have a Bible. Curiosity, or maybe just a need to feel connected to something, made me open it. The pages were thin as moth wings, whispering as I turned them. And then I saw it. Tucked into the Book of Psalms, folded into a neat, tight square, was a piece of paper. It wasn't a letter or a photograph. It was thicker, stiffer. I carefully unfolded it. The paper was brittle and yellow, covered in elegant, spidery script and official-looking stamps. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Deed of Title." I scanned the text, my heart starting a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. It described a parcel of land, 80 acres. It listed boundaries marked by things like the old stone wall and the twin oaks by the creek. The property was in a place I'd never heard of, Stone Creek County. And the name of the grantee, the owner, was Abraham Abe Thorne, my grandfather. Below his name, written in the same careful hand, but with a different pen, was another name. Mine. Maya Thorne. My first thought was that it was a mistake, a joke. My grandfather had been a carpenter, a handyman. He'd lived in a tiny rented bungalow on the edge of town. He'd had nothing. That was the story I'd been told, the story that had defined my life. He died, he had nothing, so I had nothing. That was the simple, brutal math of my existence. 80 acres of land didn't fit into that equation. I folded the paper and slipped it back into the Bible, my hands shaking. The bus station suddenly felt too small, the air too thick to breathe. I clutched the box to my chest and walked back out into the cold, the deed feeling like a burning coal in my grandfather's Bible. The city lights seemed harsh and alien. For the first time in 12 years, I had a destination. I didn't know what I would find in Stone Creek County, or if this piece of paper was anything more than a dead man's forgotten dream. But it was something. And right then, something was infinitely more than the nothing I had. It was a direction. It was a question that needed an answer. The $217 in my envelope suddenly had a purpose. I walked to the ticket counter and, with a voice that was steadier than I felt, I bought a one-way ticket to a place I had never been. A place that might, just might, be mine. The bus ride was a slow-motion shedding of my old skin. With every mile that clicked by on the highway, the gray concrete landscape of the city dissolved into the muted greens and browns of the countryside. I watched smokestacks and water towers give way to silos and barns, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The bus rattled and groaned, a mechanical beast lumbering toward the unknown, and I felt like a passenger in my own life, being carried along by a current I couldn't control. I kept the Bible on my lap, my hand resting on its worn leather cover, as if the deed hidden inside might vanish if I let it go. I reread it a dozen times, my finger tracing the legal jargon, the strange, archaic language that described a piece of the earth. Henceforth, from the large granite boulder, it sounded like a fairy tale. I was 18 years old, with a duffel bag of second-hand clothes and a box of ghosts for company. I had no business believing in fairy tales. But the paper felt real. The ink was faded but permanent. It was a fact, sitting in a world that had always felt so flimsy and uncertain. The bus finally hissed to a stop in what I assumed was the center of Stone Creek. It wasn't so much a town as a crossroads with a few buildings clinging to it for dear life. A general store with a dusty porch, a gas station with a single, ancient pump, and a squat brick building with a sign that read, Stone Creek County Courthouse. This was it. The air here was different. It smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and something wild and green that caught in the back of my throat. It was quiet, a deep, resonant quiet that was nothing like the muffled silence of the group home. This quiet had texture. It was alive. I shouldered my bag, picked up Abe's box, and stepped off the bus. The driver gave me a curious look, the kind people give to things that are out of place. A girl with a city pallor and haunted eyes didn't belong here. He was probably right. The bus pulled away with another hydraulic sigh, leaving me alone in the vast, empty quiet. I felt impossibly small. For a moment, panic seized me. This was insane. I should have stayed in the city, found a shelter, gotten a job washing dishes. That was a world I understood. This place, with its endless sky and silent, watching woods, was a foreign country. But then I thought of the alternative, a life of drifting, of being invisible, of carrying the weight of that nothingness forever. The deed in my pocket was a long shot, maybe even a cruel one, but it was the only shot I had. I took a deep breath, the cold air a shock to my system, and walked toward the courthouse. The building was even more imposing up close. It was made of dark red brick that seemed to have absorbed decades of secrets. The heavy wooden doors groaned in protest as I pushed them open. The inside smelled of floor polish and old paper. A woman with a formidable beehive of gray hair sat behind a high counter, peering at me over a pair of reading glasses. She looked as permanent as the building itself. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice a dry rustle. I felt my own voice catch. I sounded like a child. I need to ask about a property, a piece of land." I pulled the deed from my pocket, my hand trembling slightly as I unfolded it on the counter. She picked it up with a practiced air, her eyes scanning it with an efficiency that was both impressive and terrifying. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just hummed, a low, thoughtful sound. "Thorn," she said, more to herself than to me. "Haven't heard that name in a while." She turned and disappeared into a back room filled with towering shelves of massive leather-bound books. I was left alone in the echoing silence of the main hall, my own breathing sounding unnervingly loud. I could feel the weight of generations in that room, of lives recorded, of disputes settled and fates decided. I was just a footnote, a stray piece of paper that had washed up on their shore. The woman returned, carrying a book so large she had to wrestle it onto the counter. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud that seemed to shake the whole building. She licked her thumb and began turning the thick, brittle pages. "Well, I'll be," she muttered after a few minutes. "It's here. Parcel 734. 80 acres, just like it says." She looked up at me, her expression no longer bored, but sharp with curiosity. "Last registered owner, Abraham Thorne. No liens, no sales. But the taxes." She paused, running a finger down a long column of figures. "The taxes have been paid. Every year. On time. From a trust based out of a law firm in the city." A trust? My grandfather, the man who couldn't afford to keep his own house, had set up a trust? None of this made any sense. The world I thought I knew was tilting on its axis. "So, it's real," I whispered. "The land it's still his?" "According to this, it is," she said, closing the massive book. "Which would make it yours, I suppose, if you're who you say you are." She looked at me expectantly. I pushed my birth certificate and the letter from the state across the counter. She examined them, her eyes flicking back and forth between the documents and my face. "Maya Thorne," she read aloud. She nodded slowly. "Well, Maya Thorne, welcome to Stone Creek County. Looks like you own a piece of it." She gave me a thin, tight smile. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't unkind. It was the smile of someone who had seen it all and was surprised by nothing. She then gave me something else, a name. "If you're going to deal with this, you'll need a lawyer. Someone local who knows how things work around here. You should go see Arthur Abernathy. His office is just down the street, above the general store. Tell him Clara sent you." I thanked her, my head spinning. As I walked out of the courthouse and back into the piercingly bright afternoon, the world looked different. The trees seemed sharper, the sky a deeper blue. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt like it was waiting. For me. Finding Arthur Abernathy's office was easy. A faded wooden sign with gold lettering that read, "A. Abernathy, Attorney at Law," hung precariously over the entrance to a steep, narrow staircase next to the general store. The stairs creaked with every step, and the air grew thick with the smell of old books and dust. His office was a single, cluttered room, crammed with sagging bookshelves, teetering stacks of paper, and furniture that looked like it had been there since the town was founded. A man sat behind a massive oak desk, his back to me, staring out a grimy window at the street below. He was old, with a shock of white hair that stood up in tufts, and he wore a tweed jacket that was frayed at the elbows. "Mr. Abernathy?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. He turned slowly, his face a road map of wrinkles. His eyes were a pale, watery blue, but they were sharp, intelligent. They took me in, the worn-out jeans, the cheap jacket, the duffel bag, the haunted look. He didn't seem surprised. He just gestured to the worn leather chair in front of his desk. "Clara called," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Said a ghost walked into her office. Guess you're it." I sat down, placing Abe's box on the floor beside me. I felt like a defendant about to be sentenced. I handed him the deed. He took it without a word, pulling a pair of spectacles from his jacket pocket and perching them on his nose. He read it, then read it again, holding it up to the light from the window as if he could see through the paper into the past. "Abraham Thorne," he murmured. "I remember him. Not well. He kept to himself. Came here in the 70s, bought that parcel way out on the old Ridge Road. Paid cash. Folks thought he was strange. Lived like a hermit up there for a few years, then just left. Heard he moved to the city, had a grandkid. Then we heard he'd passed." He looked at me over his glasses, his gaze analytical. "And that grandkid is you." I just nodded, unable to speak. "This is a good, clean title," he said, tapping the paper with his finger. "Ironclad, as they say." And Clara was right. A trust has been paying the property taxes for the last 25 years. A blind trust, managed by a big firm downtown. It's set to dissolve on the beneficiary's 18th birthday. Today. He let that sink in. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was a plan, a meticulous, long-term plan. "My grandfather, he didn't have any money," I said, the words sounding foolish even as I spoke them. "How could he set up a trust?" Abernathy leaned back in his chair, the old leather groaning in protest. "People have secrets, kid, especially the quiet ones. Looks like your grandfather had a big one. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" I don't know," I stammered. "I want to see it, the land." He nodded, as if this was the only acceptable answer. He pulled a large, rolled-up map from a bin in the corner and spread it across his desk. It was a topographical map of the county, crisscrossed with lines and notations. He pointed with a gnarled finger. "You're here," he said, tapping the small cluster of buildings that represented the town. "And the property is way out here." His finger traced a winding line that climbed into the green, contoured section that represented the hills. "There's no bus. Road's not much more than a dirt track in places. Hard to get to if you don't know the way." A sense of deflation hit me. I was so close, yet it was still out of reach. I didn't have money for a taxi, if one even existed in this town. Abernathy seemed to read my mind. He picked up an old rotary phone on his desk and dialed a number. "Earl? Arthur. Got a job for you." "Yeah, a ride." "A young lady. Thorne's granddaughter." "Yeah, that Thorne. Out to the old property on the ridge." "Okay." He hung up the phone. "Earl will be out front of the general store in 10 minutes. He'll take you." "I can't pay," I started, my face burning with shame. "Put it on my tab," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "We'll sort it out later, once we figure out what you're really sitting on. For now, just go. See what your grandfather left you." He handed the deed back to me. On the back, I noticed something for the first time. Tucked into the corner, in my grandfather's faint, penciled handwriting, were a few words. a sentence I hadn't seen in the dim light of the bus station. It read, "The key is where the heart was." I stared at the words, a chill running down my spine. It was a riddle, a message meant only for me. I thanked Mr. Abernathy, my mind racing. What key? What heart? As I walked back down the creaking stairs and into the sunlight, I felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. I wasn't just chasing a piece of paper anymore. I was following a trail of breadcrumbs left by a man I barely knew, a man who was proving to be more complex and mysterious than I could ever have imagined. Earl was waiting, just as Abernathy had promised, leaning against a pickup truck that looked as old and weathered as he was. He was a wiry man with a kind face and hands calloused from a lifetime of work. He didn't ask many questions, just loaded my duffel and the box into the truck bed and told me to hop in. The ride out to the property was a journey back in time. We left the paved road behind, and the truck bounced and rattled along a dirt track that wound its way up into the hills. The trees grew thicker here, forming a dense canopy overhead that dappled the road in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air grew cooler, cleaner. It felt like we were entering a different world, a place that time had forgotten. After about 20 minutes, Earl slowed the truck and pointed. "This is it. As far as I can take you. The rest of the way is on foot." I looked where he was pointing. There was a break in the trees and a narrow, overgrown path that disappeared into the woods. A heavy chain was strung between two massive oak trees, blocking the entrance. A rusted, "No trespassing" sign hung from it, creaking in the breeze. Earl got out and unhooked the chain. "Abernathy called ahead," he explained. "Said you had a right to be here." I got out of the truck, my legs feeling unsteady. The silence here was even deeper than in town. It was broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. I grabbed my bag and Abe's box. "The cabin should be up that path, about a quarter-mile in," Earl said, his voice softer now. "Hasn't been anyone up here in years. Go easy." I thanked him, and he just touched the brim of his hat, got back in his truck and drove away, leaving me alone at the edge of my inheritance. I stood there for a long time, just breathing. The 80 acres stretched out around me, unseen, unheard, but I could feel their presence. It was a wild, sleeping giant. I ducked under the chain and started walking up the path, my heart pounding with a rhythm that seemed to match the ancient pulse of the woods. This was it. I was home. Or I was about to find out what was left of it. The path to the cabin was less a path and more a suggestion. It was choked with weeds and fallen branches, and in places it disappeared completely, forcing me to push my way through thickets of ferns and tangled undergrowth. The woods were alive around me. A deer startled and bounded away, a flash of white tail. A hawk circled high overhead, its cry echoing through the trees. It was beautiful, but it was also intimidating. This was not a park. This was a wild, untamed place. After what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin, and I stepped into a clearing. And there it was. The cabin. It was smaller than I had imagined, built of dark, weathered logs, with a sagging porch and a stone chimney that was crumbling at the top. The roof was covered in a thick blanket of moss, and the windows were dark and empty, like vacant eyes. A large, dilapidated barn stood a short distance away, its doors hanging crookedly on their hinges. The whole place looked like it was slowly being reclaimed by the forest, sinking back into the earth from which it had come. It looked abandoned. It looked forgotten. My heart sank. What had I been expecting? A charming cottage? A hidden treasure? This was just a ruin. A testament to a dream that had died a long time ago. But I had come this far. I had to see it through. I walked up the 3 rickety steps to the porch, which groaned under my weight. The front door was made of heavy, solid wood. There was no lock, just a simple iron latch. I lifted it, and the door swung inward with a low, mournful creak. The air that rushed out was thick and musty, the smell of trapped time. I stepped inside, my eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. The cabin was a single room. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced through the grimy windows. A thick layer of dust and leaves covered everything. There was a simple wooden table and 2 chairs in the center of the room, a rusted cast-iron stove in one corner, and a narrow cot with a rotted mattress against the far wall. It was the sparest, most basic of shelters. But the centerpiece of the room, the thing that drew my eye immediately, was the fireplace. It was massive, built of large, rounded river stones, and it took up almost the entire back wall. It was clearly the heart of the home, the source of heat and light. And then my grandfather's words echoed in my mind. The key is where the heart was. My breath caught. The hearth. I knelt on the dusty floorboards in front of the fireplace, my hands reaching out to touch the cold stones. They were solid, immovable. I ran my fingers over the rough mortar between them, searching for anything, a crack, a loose piece, a sign. I pushed and pulled, my frustration mounting. Nothing. It was just a fireplace. I was a fool, chasing a riddle in a dead man's shack. I sat back on my heels, defeated, the dust and the silence and the weight of my own dashed hopes pressing down on me. I was about to give up, to turn around and walk away from this whole crazy fantasy, when my eyes fell on one stone in particular. It was near the bottom, slightly to the left of center. It was no different in color or shape from the others, but there was something about it. A faint, almost invisible line in the mortar around it. It wasn't a crack from age. It looked deliberate. My heart started to beat faster again. I took out the small pocket knife Abe had left in the box and scraped at the line. The mortar crumbled away, soft and sandy. I worked the knife into the gap and pried. The stone resisted, then, with a low, grinding sound, it shifted. It was loose. I pulled it out. Behind it was a dark, square cavity. And inside that cavity, nestled in the darkness, was a small, metal box. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a simple tin lockbox, rusted at the edges, but heavy and solid. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid, my hands shaking so much I could barely manage it. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed cotton, were 3 things. The first was a single, ornate iron key. The second was a small, leather-bound journal. And the third was a thick stack of letters, tied together with a piece of faded twine. I lifted the letters out. The one on top was addressed to me. For Maya, it said, in my grandfather's familiar, blocky script. This was it. This was the secret. This was the reason for the land, the trust, the riddle. It was all here, in this box. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. This was all too much. The journey, the discovery, the sudden, overwhelming realization that my entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. Or not lies, perhaps, but secrets, massive, life-altering secrets. I leaned back against the cold stones of the hearth, the box in my lap, and I just breathed. You know, there are moments in your life that act as hinges, where the door to your past swings shut and the door to your future creaks open, and you're standing right there in the threshold. This was one of those moments for me. And if you've ever had a moment like that, a point where everything you thought you knew was turned upside down, then you understand the mix of terror and hope that I was feeling. It's a powerful, lonely feeling. But the community we're building here is a place where you don't have to be lonely in those moments. It's for people who get it, people who have walked through their own fires and are looking for what comes next. If that's you, take a moment to subscribe. And I mean it when I say I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments if you've ever discovered a secret that changed everything. Your story matters. Now, let's get back to what I found in that box. I sat there on the floor of the abandoned cabin for what felt like hours, just holding the stack of letters. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The air grew colder. I knew I should build a fire, find some water, think about survival. but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the weight of the story I was about to read. Finally, I took a deep, shaky breath and untied the twine. The letters were brittle with age. I opened the first one. The date at the top was from just a few weeks after I'd been taken into state care. The ink was slightly faded, but his handwriting was strong, resolute. "My dearest Maya," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone and you have come of age. It means my plan worked, at least in part. I hope, with all my heart, that you can find it in yours to forgive me. I know you must have grown up thinking I abandoned you, or that I was too poor and broken to keep you. That's the story I needed them to believe. It was the only way to keep you safe. The truth, little bird, is a lot more complicated. I didn't have a heart attack, and I wasn't poor, not in the way that matters." I had to stop and read that line again. Not a heart attack? The official story, the one that had been the bedrock of my childhood trauma, was a lie. I felt a cold knot of anger and confusion form in my stomach. I kept reading. "Before you were born, when I was a young man, I fell in with a bad crowd. I was foolish and proud, and I made a mistake. I took money from men you should never take money from. It wasn't a lot, but to them, the principle was everything. They were criminals, the kind that don't forget a debt. I spent years paying them back, always looking over my shoulder. By the time your grandmother and I had your father, I thought I was clear. We were happy. But they never really let you go. After your parents died in that car crash, and it was just you and me, they came back. They saw an opportunity." The letter went on to explain. The men my grandfather had been involved with had, over the decades, laundered their money and evolved. They were no longer street thugs, they were a corporation. Apex Holdings, a predatory development company that bought up land and assets through intimidation and extortion. They knew about the 80 acres. It wasn't just any land, it was strategically important. It had a deep, clean aquifer and was situated right where the county was planning to build a new highway in the next decade. It was worth millions, but only if they could get it for pennies on the dollar. "They came to me," he wrote. "They didn't want the money I owed them anymore. They wanted the land. They threatened me. But it wasn't me I was worried about. They threatened you, Maya. They said that if I didn't sign the deed over to them, something would happen. An accident. A little girl getting lost. They knew I would do anything to protect you. And they were right. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the page. The image of these faceless men threatening my 6-year-old self sent a wave of nausea through me. I knew I couldn't fight them directly," the letter continued. "They had lawyers and thugs and all the power. I had you, and this land. This land was the only thing of real value I ever had. Your great-grandfather homesteaded it. It was our family's anchor. I couldn't let them have it, and I couldn't let them have you. So I made a choice. I devised a plan to disappear. I cashed out a small investment your grandmother had left me, every penny I had, and used it to set up the blind trust to pay the taxes on the land, with you as the sole beneficiary, to be revealed on your 18th birthday. Then I staged my death. I had an old friend, a doctor who owed me a favor, sign a death certificate. Heart attack. Clean and simple. I packed a bag, wrote this letter, and walked away from everything I had ever known. Most importantly, I walked away from you. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Every day for the last 12 years has been a kind of death. But I did it so you could live, so you could be free. They would stop looking for the land if they thought the owner was dead and it was lost in the state system. They would move on. I hoped, by the time you were old enough to claim it, they would have forgotten all about it. I dropped the letter. Tears were streaming down my face, hot and silent. I wasn't crying for the little girl who was abandoned. I was crying for the old man who had to do the abandoning. The sacrifice he had made was monumental, a love so fierce it required him to surgically remove himself from his own life, from my life, to save me. The story of my life wasn't a tragedy of neglect. It was a desperate story of protection. He hadn't left me with nothing. He had left me with everything. He had left me with a future, hidden away where no one could find it. I sat in the growing dark, the cold seeping into my bones, and I cried for the grandfather I had lost twice, once to a lie, and now, again, to the truth. After a long time, I picked up the next letter. It was shorter, more practical. Maya, it said, I have left you with more than just the land. I have left you with a choice. This life, this fight, may not be what you want. You deserve peace. You deserve a clean start away from all this. I spent my last years working odd jobs for cash, living simply, saving every dollar. I couldn't touch a bank account for fear they'd find me. I've hidden that money on the property. It's not a fortune, but it's enough. Enough for you to walk away from this land, from this fight. You can sell the property, take the money, and disappear. Go to college, travel the world. Build a life that has nothing to do with this darkness. That is your first choice. A clean slate. Your second choice is to stay. To fight. The money is also enough to get you started. To pay the legal fees, to fix up this cabin, to make a stand. Apex Holdings is still out there. They may have forgotten about this land, but if they find out it has an owner again, they will come for it. They are vultures. Fighting them will be hard. It will be lonely. I cannot tell you which path to choose. The choice must be yours. The map to the money is in the journal. Whatever you decide, know that my last thought on this earth was of you. Be brave, little bird. Your loving grandfather, Abe. I opened the leather journal. On the first page was a hand-drawn map of the property. It showed the cabin, the barn, the creek, the twin oaks. And in the northeast corner, near the old stone wall, there was an X. Beneath it were the words, 5 paces south from the lightning-scarred pine. A treasure map. It was all so unbelievable, so cinematic, it felt like I was living in a story someone else had written. But the dirt on my hands, the cold in my bones, the weight of the letters in my lap, it was all real. I had a choice. A real, tangible choice for the first time in my life. I could run, or I could fight. I could take the gift of escape he had given me, or I could honor the gift of the land he had died to protect. I didn't know the answer. I only knew one thing for sure. I had to find that money. I had to see if this last, incredible part of his story was true. I spent a cold, fitful night on the cot, wrapped in Abe's old flannel shirt, the letters and the journal clutched to my chest. The woods outside were alive with sounds, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I felt my grandfather's presence in the creak of the old logs, in the whisper of the wind through the chimney. He was here. He had never really left. The next morning, I woke with the sun. The light streaming through the dusty windows was pale and golden. My body ached from the cold and the hard cot, but my mind was clear, focused. I had a mission. I ate the last of the protein bars from my bag, drank from a stream I found behind the cabin. The water was icy and tasted of stone and moss, and set out with the journal in my hand. I followed the map, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The land was even wilder than I had realized. The forest floor was a thick carpet of leaves and pine needles, and the air was sharp with the scent of pine. I found the old stone wall, crumbling but still standing, a silent testament to some long-forgotten farmer's labor. I followed it until I saw it, a massive pine tree, its trunk split and blackened by a lightning strike from long ago. It was a stark, dramatic landmark. 5 paces south, I whispered to myself, the words sounding loud in the stillness. I lined myself up with the tree and took 5 deliberate steps, my boots sinking into the soft earth. I marked the spot with a rock. Then I began to dig. I had no shovel, so I used my hands and a sharp-edged stone. The work was slow and grueling. The ground was hard, laced with a web of tough roots. My fingers grew raw, my muscles screamed in protest. I dug for what felt like hours. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe I had misread the map. Maybe the money was gone, or had never been there at all. Maybe this was the final, cruel joke in a long, sad story. I was exhausted, covered in dirt, and on the verge of tears. I was about to give up when my fingers hit something hard. It wasn't a rock. It was flat, metallic. A surge of adrenaline shot through me, erasing all my fatigue. I dug faster, frantically clearing the dirt away. It was another metal box, much larger and heavier than the one I'd found in the hearth. It was an old military-style ammo can, sealed tight. It took all my strength to haul it out of the hole. I sat back, breathing heavily, and stared at it. With trembling hands, I worked the latches. They were stiff with rust, but they finally gave way with a loud clang. I lifted the lid. My breath hitched in my throat. It was full of cash. Bundles of 20s, 50s, and 100s, wrapped in rubber bands. On top of the bundles was another, final note. "This is for you, Maya. Your choice. Your life. Be happy. Abe." I didn't count it, not right away. I just ran my hands over it. It felt impossible. It was the physical manifestation of my grandfather's love, of his sacrifice. It was the price of my freedom. As I sat there, in a patch of sunlight in the middle of 80 acres of wild land that was mine, with a box of money at my feet, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I had forgotten it was even on. The signal was weak, just one bar, but it was enough. The caller ID was Arthur Abernathy. I answered, my voice hoarse. "Maya? Thank God, I was getting worried," he said, his gravelly voice a strange intrusion from the outside world. "Listen, something's happened. I got a call this morning, an offer on your property." My blood ran cold. An offer? From who? A lawyer representing a corporation, Apex Holdings. The name hit me like a physical blow. They had found me, or they had found the land. He said they've been monitoring the county records for this parcel for years. The moment the trust was dissolved and the ownership transferred to you, it triggered an alert in their system. They're moving fast. What are they offering?" I asked, my voice trembling. "A lot," Abernathy said, and he named a figure that made my head spin. It was an obscene amount of money, more money than I could ever have imagined. It was, "Go away and never think about this again," money. It was enough to make the cash in the box at my feet look like pocket change. "They want an answer by the end of the day," Abernathy continued. "It's a cash offer, quick closing. They're not playing around, kid." Here it was, the choice, laid out before me in the starkest possible terms. On one hand, a life of unimaginable wealth and ease. I could take their offer, add it to Abe's savings, and vanish. I would be set for life. I would never have to worry about money or hunger or a place to sleep ever again. I could have the clean slate my grandfather wanted for me. On the other hand, this land, this cabin, this story, this legacy of defiance that had been bought at such a terrible price. Selling it would be like spitting on his grave. It would mean that his sacrifice, his 12 years of lonely exile, his staged death, all of it was for nothing. The vultures would win. I looked at the cabin, its sagging roof and dark windows. I looked at the trees, their leaves shimmering in the sunlight. I felt the solid earth beneath me. This wasn't just dirt and trees. This was the last piece of my family. It was the only home I had ever really had. And in that moment, the choice became startlingly, terrifyingly clear. "No," I said into the phone, my voice ringing with a certainty that surprised me. "What was that?" Abernathy asked. "Tell them no," I said, stronger this time. "Tell them the property is not for sale. Not now, not ever." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, I heard Arthur Abernathy let out a slow, low chuckle. "Atta girl," he said. "I'll call you back." He hung up. I put the phone back in my pocket. I closed the lid on the ammo can. I stood up and looked out at my land. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And I was ready. I buried the box of money again, in a new spot, deeper this time. I kept only a few bundles, enough for the immediate future, and tucked them into my duffel bag. Then I walked back down the path, my steps lighter than they had been on the way up. The land no longer felt intimidating. It felt like an ally. When I reached the chained-off entrance, Arthur Abernathy was there, waiting for me in his dusty sedan. He didn't say anything, just opened the passenger door. I got in. "So," he said as we drove back toward town, "you decided to pick a fight with a rattlesnake." "It's my fight," I said, looking out the window at the passing trees. "It's my land." He nodded, a small, approving smile on his face. "Yes, it is. And that means something in this county." We drove straight to his office. I walked up the creaking stairs, but this time, I didn't feel like an intimidated child. I felt like a client. I walked into his cluttered office, took the cash out of my bag, and placed it on his desk. "I'm hiring you, Mr. Abernathy," I said. "I want you to be my lawyer. I want to secure the title, clear any outstanding debts from the trust, and file whatever we need to file to protect this land from Apex." He looked at the stack of money, then back at me. His watery blue eyes seemed to see right through me, right down to the core of fear and determination that was holding me together. "This is a retainer," I added, pushing the money forward. "There's more where that came from for legal fees." He leaned back in his chair, the old leather groaning. He steepled his fingers and looked at me for a long time. "Apex Holdings," he said slowly, "is a patient predator. They won't give up easily. They'll try to find legal loopholes. They'll try to challenge the chain of title. They'll try to bleed you dry with court costs. This won't be a quick battle. It could take years." "I know," I said. "My grandfather knew. He left me prepared." Abernathy finally reached out and pulled the stack of money toward him. "All right, Maya Thorne," he said, and for the first time, he sounded not just like a lawyer, but like a partner. "Let's go to war." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. We spent hours in his office, poring over maps and legal documents. He filed motions, sent letters, and built a legal fortress around my 80 acres. Apex pushed back, of course. Their lawyers sent threatening letters, filed frivolous challenges. But Abernathy met them at every turn, his knowledge of local property law a weapon they hadn't anticipated. While he fought the legal battle, I fought my own. I moved into the cabin. I used some of the money to buy supplies in town: tools, nails, tar for the roof, glass for the windows. I bought a new mattress, a wood-burning stove, and enough canned goods to last the winter. The people in town, who had at first been suspicious of me, started to warm up. Earl, the man who had given me a ride, helped me clear the path to the cabin. The woman at the general store started setting aside fresh vegetables for me. They were a quiet, reserved people, but they respected resilience. They saw a young woman fighting for her family's land against a faceless corporation, and they understood that story. I worked from sunrise to sunset. I patched the roof, replaced the broken windows, and scrubbed away decades of dust and grime. I repaired the crumbling chimney, stone by stone. With every nail I hammered, with every board I replaced, I felt like I was not just rebuilding a cabin, but rebuilding myself. I was taking the broken pieces of my past and creating something solid, something real. Some days were hard. The loneliness was a physical presence, a constant ache in my chest. I missed my grandfather with a ferocity that stole my breath. I would find myself talking to him as I worked, telling him about my progress, asking for his advice. And in the quiet hum of the forest, in the warmth of the fire I built in his hearth, I felt his answer. He had left me more than land and money. He had left me a purpose. He had left me his strength. He had taught me that a home isn't just a structure of wood and stone. A home is a place you are willing to fight for. It's a story you refuse to let die. I was no longer Maya Thorne, ward of the state. I was Maya Thorne, the girl on the ridge, the keeper of the land, the inheritor of a legacy of love and defiance. The system had tried to erase me, to turn me into a statistic. My grandfather had ensured I would become a landmark. It's been a year now. The legal battle with Apex has quieted down. They realized we weren't going to be an easy target, and they've moved on. For now. I know they'll be back one day, but I'll be ready for them. The cabin is no longer a ruin. It's a home. It's small and rustic, but it's warm, and it's mine. I've planted a garden. I've learned the names of the birds, the patterns of the seasons. I found a peace in these woods that I never knew existed. I found my grandfather's grave in a small, forgotten cemetery on the other side of the county. He'd used a false name, but the dates matched. I visit him every week. I tell him he can rest now. I tell him I'm safe. I tell him thank you. This land, this inheritance, it wasn't about the money. It was about the truth. It was about discovering that the story of my life wasn't one of abandonment, but of protection. It was about learning that the greatest treasures are not the ones that can be bought or sold, but the ones that are passed down: courage, resilience, and a place to call home. My story taught me that sometimes the things we inherit aren't easy. They come with burdens, with fights we didn't ask for. But they are also the things that make us who we are. They give us our roots, and they give us our reason to grow. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to fight for your own piece of the world, or for the truth of your own story, I hope you'll subscribe and become a part of this community. Share your own story of inheritance, of struggle, of finding home, in the comments below. I read every single one. Because every story of resilience deserves to be heard, and every person deserves a place where they feel they belong.